Dr. Maxine Max Ross stood in the middle of the lab, her wild, curly hair barely restrained by a messy bun. Her lab coat was untidy, and the cuffs of her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. She wasn't the type to worry about appearances. In fact, she hadn't showered in 48 hours. Not that anyone would notice. Her lab was chaotic, papers strewn across the floor, holographic screens hovering at strange angles, and the persistent whir of quantum computers humming in the background. It looked like the set of a science fiction movie, and to Max, it felt like one, too. Only it wasn't fiction. This was her life. She leaned over a glowing, translucent panel, fingers typing furiously. Her assistant, a grizzled hacker named Alec, stood by, eyes glued to a separate terminal. His posture was slouched, as though he'd been sitting there for hours, probably because he had. "We're getting closer," Alec said, tapping his screen and biting his lip. "The data is, well, it's pretty much impossible to parse, but there's definitely something moving through the quantum grid." Max didn't respond. She wasn't listening to him anymore. She was too absorbed in the glowing patterns unfolding on her own display, a confusing, spiraling dance of data that didn't make any sense. Yet, somehow, it felt familiar. As though it was trying to communicate with her. "We should shut it down," Alec urged, his voice tinged with urgency. "Just a few more minutes," Max said absently, swiping the data aside to reveal an encrypted sublayer of code. "This isn't just a glitch. There's something here, something intentional." "Intentional?" Alec raised an eyebrow, but Max didn't notice. With a final keystroke, she unlocked the hidden layer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered, then everything went dark, the entire lab went silent. The low hum of the machine stopped. It was as though the world itself had paused. Max frowned, tapping the edge of her screen. "Nothing." Alec stood up straighter, now paying full attention. "Max, what did you do?" But Max didn't answer. Her heart rate was spiking as she studied the now empty interface. Then came the flicker. The entire lab seemed to shake for just a second. The lights flickered overhead. Then they stabilized, and the terminal booted up again, but this time, the data on the screen was different. It was alive. Max's fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant to touch anything. The patterns that had appeared were unfamiliar but eerie. They weren't the normal quantum data they'd been working on. These were not just numbers and variables. This was code that could only be described as organic, living, almost aware. "Max?" Alec's voice was softer now, cautious. Max's eyes were wide, glued to the screen. "It's a virus. A quantum virus." Alec's face twisted into confusion. "A virus? Are you sure? How could that be?" Before Max could explain, the screens around them flickered once more. Data began scrolling rapidly across the terminals, and the air seemed to buzz with an electric charge. Then, she saw it. A string of code. No, a message, embedded within the quantum pulse, flickered on her terminal screen. It was a sequence of numbers, followed by a phrase in block letters: "Humanity is not destined to survive. Change history." Max's breath caught in her throat. She leaned in closer, her fingers shaking slightly as she reached for the keyboard. Alec's face turned pale as he read the words. That's not possible." "We're seeing data from the future," Alec said, his voice low. Max nodded, her thoughts racing. This isn't just any virus. It's not like anything we've ever studied. It's alive, and it's manipulating time itself." Max gathered the team in the conference room a few hours later. There was her right-hand woman, Dr. Lana Patel, a historian with a sharp mind and a sarcastic edge, and then there was the team's philosopher, Ethan Quinn. Ethan had a habit of overthinking things and a penchant for long-winded, often tangential, philosophical monologues. Max hadn't had much sleep in the last 48 hours, but she didn't have time to rest. The virus was here, and it wasn't just a random anomaly in the system. It was something more, something far bigger than they could comprehend. But if there was one thing she knew about the human race, it was that they could never resist trying to understand the impossible. What the hell happened? Lana asked, looking over the data Max had gathered. This isn't a glitch. This is an intervention. We're seeing traces of quantum signatures from the future, from a timeline we didn't even think was possible. It's almost like it's writing history itself. I think it's rewriting it, Max corrected her. Not writing it anew, rewriting what has already happened. Lana frowned. You're saying someone from the future is altering our past? But why? What's the point? Ethan, ever the philosopher, put his hands together in front of his face. Perhaps history is doomed to repeat itself, and the future knows it. Perhaps, by altering key moments, they believe they can prevent their own destruction. Max nodded. That's exactly what I'm thinking. What's the catch, though? Alec asked, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Why would anyone want to change the past? Why not just leave it alone? Because they can't, Max said simply. They're stuck in a future that's unsustainable. Civilization is teetering on the edge of collapse, and they've discovered a way to trace the past. Not destroy it. Rewriting history isn't the end game, it's the beginning of a new one. They can't fix their mistakes, so they're using this virus to retrace time and make sure the past leads to a different future. The room went silent as everyone processed the implications. So, Lana began slowly, you're saying that this virus isn't about destroying humanity. It's about reshaping the past to create a future where they survive? Exactly, Max said, her voice steady. We have to stop it before it's too late. Before they change too much. Ethan folded his arms across his chest, his brow furrowed. But how do we stop something that's embedded in the fabric of time itself? The team worked around the clock, trying to reverse engineer the virus and find a way to isolate its source. They built a quantum interface, a device designed to send messages back in time. Max knew that it was an untested theory, but desperation drove her forward. They needed to send a message to the past, back to the point where the virus first began to infect history. Weeks passed, and the virus continued to infect historical records. Political documents, historical texts, even personal stories started to change. Small things, insignificant events that, on the surface, seemed unimportant but enough to change the course of history. As Max watched the world around her slowly shift, she felt the gravity of the situation bearing down on her, and then, one night, they found it. A glitch in the system. A trace left by the virus, a breadcrumb in the quantum field. They followed it back in time, deeper and deeper into the fabric of history itself until they reached the moment where it all began. The creation of the virus. But when they found the source, it wasn't what they expected. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a machine. It was a paradox. A quantum loop. A single event, generated by the future itself, in order to ensure its own existence. A future society, seeing its inevitable collapse, had devised a way to alter the past. But in doing so, they'd created something far worse. Now, Max and her team were faced with an impossible decision: destroy the virus and risk destroying the future, or let it continue, rewriting history as it saw fit. They had no way of knowing if the future they were protecting would be worth it, but one thing was clear: history was no longer a fixed thing. It was a fluid, malleable entity, and they were at its mercy. Axe leaned over the control panel, fingers shaking slightly as she adjusted the quantum algorithm. Her eyes darted over the swirling data on the screens, her mind racing. The paradox: they had uncovered an event from the future that was actively rewriting the past was more than just a problem. It was a symptom of something much larger, something that could unravel everything they thought they knew about time, reality, and existence itself. The quantum loop they had traced back to was like a broken thread, a knot in the timeline, its origins hidden in a distant future. The virus wasn't simply a piece of rogue code. It was a kind of feedback mechanism, a way for future humans to reach back in time and alter key historical events. The ultimate goal wasn't to destroy humanity, as Alec had feared. The virus was designed to change history in small, subtle ways that would eventually ensure the survival of a future civilization on the brink of collapse. It was a paradoxical dance. The future, by trying to correct the past, was reshaping both. As Max examined the data, her mind kept circling back to one terrifying question: if they stopped the virus, would it erase the future? Would it erase everything they had uncovered, their discoveries, their progress? The future, once untouched, would cease to exist. But if they allowed the virus to continue, what would happen to history as they knew it? Would they even be able to recognize the world around them anymore? "We're running out of time," Alex said, breaking her train of thought. He'd been standing silently by her side for the past few minutes, watching her analyze the quantum signatures. His tone was sharp, filled with frustration, but there was also fear. It was evident in the way his fingers hovered above his keyboard, as though he was afraid to make the wrong move. "I know," Max murmured, eyes still glued to the screen. "We need to send a message before it's too late. If we can just isolate the moment where the loop begins, maybe we can stop it. We can't let this virus grow any stronger." The data was coming in faster now, more erratically. Each new line of code, each flashing digit, felt like it was pushing them deeper into an abyss of uncertainty. There was a sense of urgency in the air, an electric charge that made everything feel both thrilling and terrifying at once. Max glanced over at Lana, who had been monitoring the historical records. Her face was pale, the usual sarcasm absent from her voice. "It's happening again," she said, her words clipped. "Another document's gone missing. The Treaty of Paris vanished from the archives, like it was never there." Max's heart skipped a beat. The virus had already begun to alter history, erasing and replacing small events that, over time, would cascade into larger changes. The Treaty of Paris, though not the most significant event in world history, had played a pivotal role in shaping European relations and global politics. If it was gone, what did that mean for the world's current political landscape? "Get the historical data back up," Max snapped. "We need a clean copy of that document. Now." Lana didn't need to be told twice. She moved quickly to one of the other terminals, pulling up a backup file of the treaty. "Got it," she said, her fingers flying across the keys. "But we don't have time to go back and fix every single document that the virus is messing with. We need to stop it at the source. We need to get to the quantum loop before it spirals out of control." Max nodded. "Exactly. We trace it, isolate the point of origin, and sever the link. But how do we even sever a link in the fabric of time?" Ethan asked from the corner of the room, his hands stuffed in his pockets, an unsettling look of contemplation in his eyes. "What happens when you start cutting at the threads of history?" Max didn't have an answer. She didn't know what would happen if they tried to undo the virus's influence. She didn't even know if the timeline could survive such a drastic intervention. But the alternative was to let history continue its strange, unpredictable path, shaped by forces they couldn't control. "That was unacceptable. We'll figure it out as we go," she said, more out of desperation than confidence. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. If we don't act now, we'll lose the future and the past forever." Alec finally spoke up, his voice tinged with impatience. "Max, if we're going to send a message back through the quantum field, we need to make sure we're sending the right one. One wrong move and we could end up making things worse. How do you know that reversing the virus won't just make everything collapse?" Max didn't have a good answer. The truth was, she had no idea. The technology they were using to communicate with the past was untested, uncharted territory. The consequences of tampering with time were too vast to predict. But every instinct in her screamed that they had no other choice. Max turned to Ethan, who had been unusually quiet for the last few minutes, lost in thought. He was staring at the quantum data on the screen, his mind processing everything in the way only philosophers could. "What's the problem, Ethan?" Max asked. "You look like you're about to solve the meaning of life." Ethan glanced up, his brow furrowed in a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. I'm thinking about the implications of all this. You've got a future civilization, one that's on the brink of collapse, using this virus to alter the past. But that raises a larger question. If the future is already trying to rewrite the past, who's to say the past isn't already rewritten? Maybe this virus is part of a cycle that's been going on for millennia. Max's mind raced. It was an unsettling thought. If history had already been manipulated by the future, if this was all part of a loop that had already happened countless times, then what did that mean for free will? Was everything predetermined? Were they already living in a version of history that had been rewritten too many times to count? She shook her head. We can't afford to get lost in paradoxes, Ethan. We need to focus on the here and now. The virus is in the present. We stop it now, or it keeps going. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. Ethan didn't seem convinced, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention back to the data. Max could see the conflict in his eyes. Philosophically, he was grappling with a much larger issue than the immediate danger they faced. But she didn't have time for philosophical musings. Not when history itself was hanging in the balance. We're tracing the virus back to a quantum anomaly, Max said, turning back to the control panel. We know it originated from a future society. The problem is we don't know where in time it began. There's no clear starting point. It could be any moment, any time, and if we miss it, we'll never be able to reverse it. Lana finished for her, her voice tight with fear. Max exhaled slowly. Exactly. And that's why we need to be quick. Alec, prepare the quantum retrace protocol. We're sending a message back to the point where it all began. Whatever it takes, we need to stop the virus from taking root. Alec gave a reluctant nod, fingers tapping furiously at his keyboard as he activated the retrace system. The lab's atmosphere grew heavier as the quantum data began to pulse, each shift of energy sending a ripple through the room. Max stood still, watching as the holographic interface in front of her flickered, the timeline warping before her eyes. She had no idea what would happen next. Would they succeed in sending their message back through the fabric of time? Or would their interference make things worse? All she knew was that this was their last shot. History, both past and future, was teetering on the edge. And if they couldn't find a way to stop the virus, the timeline they knew would cease to exist. The message, once sent, would be their only chance. Max took a deep breath and pressed the button. Time, she hoped, would answer. Axe stared at the screen, heart pounding, as the quantum retrace protocol spun into action. The air around her seemed to crackle with static, the machines humming louder than ever. The data danced and flickered before her, swirling in intricate patterns that defied logic. It felt as though time itself were warping, bending in response to the algorithm she had set in motion. For a moment, everything stopped. Silence blanketed the lab, then, like a switch had been flipped, the screens exploded with activity. Lines of code flew across the terminals at breakneck speed, forming an elaborate web of quantum signals that Max could barely keep up with. It was as though she had opened a door to another dimension, and the universe was rushing to fill the void. Alec was typing furiously, his face taut with concentration. "We're in," he muttered, his eyes darting over the interface. "We've established the trace. Sending the message now." Max could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. This was it. The point of no return. They were about to send their message back into the past, trying to prevent the virus from taking hold, but the consequences were beyond their understanding. If they succeeded, they could stop the future from rewriting history. If they failed, she didn't dare finish the thought. "We need to target the moment it all started," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We can't let this loop go any further." Lana, who had been monitoring the data from the historical archives, glanced over at Max. "I think we're too late," she said, her voice tinged with dread. "Another document's gone this time. It's the Magna Carta. It's like these things are just disappearing off the face of history. The virus is erasing them faster than we can track." Max clenched her fists. This was worse than she thought. The virus wasn't just changing history, it was erasing it, deleting key moments like they had never happened at all. The Treaty of Paris, the Magna Carta, two of the most important documents in shaping modern civilization, gone. If they didn't act now, entire civilizations, systems of thought, and entire histories would vanish. Keep tracking them, Max said through gritted teeth. If we can just stop the virus before it gets too powerful. Alec interrupted her, his voice tight with urgency. Max, we're losing control of the quantum field. The message is being warped. Max looked over at the terminal where Alec was working. The quantum loop had already started to distort their communication. The virus was aware of their interference, fighting back against their attempt to stop it. Time, it seemed, had become a battlefield. Recalibrate the parameters, Max said, trying to keep calm. We need to isolate the quantum frequency before it overpowers us. Lana's voice broke through the tension. We've lost more than just documents. A significant portion of recorded history is now blank, like it never existed. If the virus continues this way, the past will be unrecognizable. The timeline will collapse entirely. Max's mind raced. The stakes had never been higher. If they didn't succeed in this moment, the virus would not only rewrite history, it would rewrite the very fabric of reality, rendering everything that had come before as though it never mattered. Max, Ethan called from the back of the room, his voice low and thoughtful. What if this is the future rewriting the past? What if this is how it has to happen? Max shot him a quick glance. We don't have time for this, Ethan. We're here to stop it, not let it happen. But Ethan didn't seem to hear her. He was pacing now, his mind clearly somewhere else. Maybe we're just another iteration, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Maybe this is part of a larger loop. What if our very existence is a consequence of this virus? If we erase it, are we erasing ourselves? Max felt a chill run down her spine. The possibility he was raising was terrifying. What if the future had already altered their past to the point where they were the product of a version of history that had been rewritten countless times? What if they were just pawns in a game played by future humans who had no idea they were being manipulated by their own creation? But she couldn't afford to entertain those thoughts. Not now. We don't have time for what-ifs, she said, her voice sharp. We have a timeline to save, and the only way forward is through. Alec's fingers flew across his console, his brow furrowed in concentration. I've found the source, he said suddenly, his voice filled with a mix of relief and alarm. It's a loop, a quantum anomaly, embedded deep in a moment of history. But we can't reach it directly. It's too well hidden. Max's pulse quickened. Where is it? Right at the beginning, Alec said, pausing for a moment. The first breach in the timeline. The point where it all started. Max's mind spun. The moment when everything had gone wrong. She had suspected that this was where the virus had originated, the initial crack in the fabric of time, the point of divergence. If they could stop it there, they could prevent the virus from spreading. But the question lingered in her mind, like a shadow she couldn't escape. If they succeeded, would they destroy their own reality in the process? Lana spoke up, her voice laced with tension. We can't risk erasing too much. If we stop the virus from reaching the past, what happens to us? What happens to the world as we know it? Max glanced at her. It's a risk we have to take. The alternative is worse. We can't let this continue. It's already too late to save everything. But we can stop the virus from growing. Alec hit a few final keys on his terminal, his hands trembling. I'm opening the trace now, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. We'll send the message to the exact moment where it all started. If we can sever the link at the source, we might have a chance. Max took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. She pressed the button, the lab went dark. The hum of the quantum machines fell silent. Max's heart pounded in her ears as she waited for anything to happen. For a long moment, nothing. Then, slowly, the machines powered back up. The screens flickered. Data flooded back into the system, but something was different. Max's breath caught in her throat as the timeline began to shift. Slowly, hesitantly, as though the universe were testing their interference, the past started to change. The quantum field was reconfiguring itself. Events were slipping into place, small, subtle shifts that Max couldn't quite understand. The virus was rewiring history, but this time, the changes weren't erasures. They were corrections. As if the timeline had finally received a message from the past, Max watched the data, her mind racing. Had they succeeded? Was it working? Then, the final moment came. The screens went blank. A wave of dizziness swept over her, as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss. The silence in the lab was deafening. It felt like an eternity before anything else happened. Then, finally, the screens lit up again. Alec looked up, his face pale but filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "It's over," he said quietly. "The virus is gone. It's no longer in the timeline." Max's heart thudded in her chest. They had done it. The virus had been stopped, but as she stared at the flickering screens, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had changed. Something deep inside her, a part of her being, was different. She had been part of a grand experiment in time, a fragile, delicate fabric that now seemed to stretch and twist in ways she couldn't understand. "What does this mean?" Lana asked, her voice soft. Max didn't have an answer. They had stopped the virus, yes. But the price they had paid, the weight of altering time, was still heavy on her mind. She looked at the team, each of them as lost in thought as she was. They had saved history. They had stopped the virus from changing the past, but what had they done to the future?